Thank you, Neil. Now, more than 500 people were arrested on the 9th of August at a rally supporting Palestine Action, a group prescribed by the government last month as a terror organisation. There was, in fact, another arrest today outside that magistrates' court hearing of Liam O'Gahany, the kneecap rapper who's himself facing that terrorism charge. Many are looking at the hundreds of people now facing potential prison sentences, people who often don't appear to meet the usual demographic profile of a terrorist, and they ask, are we really going to send them all to jail? Let us hear from one person who was arrested that day, retired Colonel Chris Romberg. He was at the rally organised by Defend Our Juries. He was holding a placard reading, "I support Palestine Action." I spoke to Chris earlier. He told me he doesn't class himself as a supporter of the proscribed group.
I'm 75 years old. I am a retired army officer. I served in various appointments in the army and ended up with the rank of colonel. And since leaving the army, I have been quite active in support of issues to do with Palestine, and that's particularly so in the last 2 years.
You're generally law-abiding fellow, Chris?
I have never previously been arrested. I must say that I've never been a member of Palestine Action. I don't know anyone in Palestine Action, and I've never encouraged anyone to join.
I wonder why that day, on that Saturday, you didn't go on a Palestinian supporting march. You went on a march supporting a group who had been prescribed as a terrorist organisation. You didn't go out and say, I support the rights of Palestinians in Gaza. You went out and said, I support Palestine Action.
Because I see the prohibition as part of an attempt for suppression of the voices for the people of Palestine. And since the prohibition, there appear to be, so it's been reported, a number of cases where voices have been silenced who have had nothing to do with Palestine Action, but who are speaking up for Palestine. I have, in fact, been on many marches and protests for Palestine. I am a member of a group called Holocaust Survivors and Descendants Against the Gaza Genocide. My father and grandparents had to flee the Nazis after the Germans took over in Austria in 1938. And we have actual survivors of the Holocaust and those whose parents and grandparents survived the Holocaust who join the protest against what is happening in Gaza and to speak out.
I mean, a lot of this issue comes down to what the legitimate tools of protest are and causing millions of pounds worth of criminal damage. I guess, is it legitimate? Is it not legitimate for government to say we want to close down an organisation creating that kind of criminal damage?
There are laws against criminal damage, and the government can use those laws and prosecute people who cause criminal damage. And they can stand in front of a jury, and the jury can decide whether they are guilty or not guilty. And other groups who we now celebrate, such as the suffragettes, have done considerable actions. They used arson, they used bombs, they used criminal damage, they used attacks on people. And now we celebrate them because of the rights that they won that we can benefit from.
I mean, it may be that we don't know the full situation, that you don't know the full situation, the background to the circumstances in which the Home Secretary prescribed the group Palestine Action. And I wonder whether, in the absence of really knowing everything, why you would stand at a protest saying, I support them. You haven't the knowledge, perhaps, that the Home Secretary has.
That is possible, but the case does not appear to have been made. And many people appear to be distrustful of what the government is saying about this and don't think that the case has been made. This prohibition appears to have been used in a way that is suppressing the voices that are speaking out against the crimes against humanity.
Now, you have been arrested, you're not being kept on remand, and you have not been charged. What have you actually heard, and what are you expecting to happen?
I and many others, the hundreds who were arrested on that day, have been released on street bail, as it's known, and we have the condition that we must not take part in any further protest to do with Palestine Action and to report back in October to a police station.
What's the maximum sentence for a charge that they might potentially level against you? Have you, in your head, worked out what the worst case for you as a result of your protest that Saturday? Have you worked out what the worst case could be?
We were arrested under Section 13 of the Terrorism Act, and if charged and tried, would be in a magistrate's court, and the maximum prison sentence is 6 months. If I were charged and tried and sentenced, it would, of course, have serious implications, and this is a serious risk, which I don't underestimate. But sometimes risks have to be taken.
And just for the record, do you regard yourself as a terrorist, Chris?
I do not regard myself as a terrorist, and I would expect that those around me also did not regard themselves as terrorists. And I would think that most people in the country looking at those who were arrested would not think that these are terrorists. Next to me arrested was an 89-year-old woman, a blind man sitting in a wheelchair, priests, a retired magistrate. All of these have been arrested under the Terrorism Act. These were people who were demonstrating, and they were demonstrating in particular because they were opposing the genocide. Those were the first 3 words on the signs that we held, saying, "I oppose genocide."
That was Chris Romberg, retired colonel, arrested back on August the 9th. Well, after I'd spoken to Chris, I spoke to Lord MacDonald, Ken MacDonald, former Director of Public Prosecutions between 2003 and 2008, actually the one before Sir Keir Starmer. I asked Lord MacDonald what he would do with hundreds of people arrested for supporting Palestine action if he was still in post.
Well, you get a file of evidence from the police and you consider whether it meets the test for prosecution, which is to say, is there a realistic prospect of conviction on this evidence, more than 50% chance, and would a prosecution be in the public interest? I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever that Palestine action is involved in serious organised criminal activity, including targeting damage against national security assets, as we've seen. And there's also no doubt, actually, that some of its activity meets the definition of terrorism, because as well as defining politically motivated acts of violence within the definition of terrorism, the legislation also includes politically and ideologically motivated acts of damage to property. But I must say my view is that just because some Palestine action activity meets the definition, that doesn't mean that it should be included within this legislation and should be prescribed. And I think the government has probably been rather unwise to pursue this course in the case of this organisation.
I mean, would you think Palestine Action as a group meet what would be the public's notion of what comprises terrorism as such?
Well, I think that's the whole problem. And I think you've put your finger on it. I mean, I've got 2 main concerns. First of all, this is, to my knowledge, the first time we have prescribed an organisation whose activities seem directed solely at causing damage rather than using violence against people, bombings, stabbings, car rammings, and so on. And secondly, to your point, this is the first time, I think, we've prescribed an organisation which, in inverted commas, campaigns around an issue that's supported by literally millions of otherwise law-abiding people. And I think the arrests of over 500 people a little while ago demonstrate that. I mean, they're no doubt overwhelmingly people with no previous convictions and otherwise respectable. We're told that nuns, vicars, and doctors were among them. And notably, the average age of those arrested was 55, which is an extraordinarily high average age for arrestees at a demonstration. I mean, I've always thought there's a good rule of thumb for the government that you shouldn't bring in laws, especially terrorism laws, that are likely to result in the arrests of multiple elderly vicars.
Let me ask you this, though. What would you actually do about these arrests? Would you, as a DPP, say there's no public interest in pursuing these hundreds of retired vicars or whoever, and let's just drop it?
Well, I think Parliament, having passed this legislation, as DPP, I'd have to be loyal to that. And if there was evidence that they had supported this organisation, and holding up a banner saying, "I support this organisation," seems to be evidence of that, I'd probably authorise prosecutions. I mean, I think one of the issues here is that there could be very serious consequences for these people that they hadn't necessarily considered. I mean, if they now have convictions or acquire convictions for supporting a terrorist organisation under UK legislation, they will never be allowed to travel to the United States. And I would be very surprised when the EU brings in its own version of ESTA, Electronic Travel Organisation, in a few months, whether many EU countries would be prepared to admit individuals from the UK who have a UK conviction for supporting a terrorist organisation. So I think that the consequences of these convictions are serious. But if you're DPP and if Parliament has passed the law, you can't decline to bring prosecutions just because you disagree with what Parliament has done. So I think if the evidential threshold is met, many of these people, if not all of those, in respect of whom the evidential threshold is met, will indeed be prosecuted.
I mean, obviously, our criminal justice system is quite stretched at the moment, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
prison places, we're releasing people for doing things, crimes, huge backlogs in the court system. Would it be well advised to pursue hundreds of cases that might put people in prison for holding up placards?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. It's not going to be very helpful so far as prison capacity is concerned. But I think the broader point is that we don't want to allow terrorism legislation and concepts of terrorism to leak more broadly into our criminal law. I mean, in authoritarian regimes like Turkey, for example, they're always locking up journalists on terrorism offences for reporting what's happening in Kurdish parts of that country. Now, I'm not suggesting this is anything like that, but I think we have to be very careful to keep terrorism where it belongs. Serious personal violence, bombings, stabbings, car rammings, the sorts of things that the general public thinks of as terrorism. And I think the problem with this proscribing of Palestine action is that it goes beyond that public conception, and I think that's dangerous and should have been avoided.
Criminal damages against the law.
Yeah,
Would
of
it
course.
well, talk me through the other option, if you like, than prescribing as a terrorist organisation Palestine Action?
Well, when I was DPP, we had a lot of activity. You'll remember in the early 2000s from the Animal Liberation Front. We had labs attacked. We had all sorts of acts of criminal damage. We prosecuted them out of existence through existing criminal damage laws. You can go to prison for a very long time for conspiring to cause criminal damage and for committing acts of criminal damage. Extinction Rebellion, we prosecuted effectively into silence using conventional criminal laws. I mean, both of those organizations technically were falling foul of terrorism legislation because they were committing criminal damage for political or ideological motives, which is the definition of terrorism. But we never before prosecuted an organization which has only targeted criminal damage. The organizations that have previously been prescribed have also been involved in encouraging, supporting, conspiring to commit personal acts of violence against human beings. And I think that's the Rubicon that we've crossed here.
Lord MacDonald, Ken MacDonald there, former DPP, on Palestine Action and the terror charges. We did ask the Home Office for a response. They haven't provided one. They did direct us, by the way, to a piece in The Observer last Sunday, written by Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. And in that, she says Palestine Action's campaigning didn't just involve criminal damage, but also intimidation, violence, weapons, and serious injuries to individuals. And based on advice and intelligence from the counter-terrorism system, she was satisfied relevant tests for prescription had been met. 14 minutes to 6 now. Why don't we just have a quick last look at some other PM headlines?
The United States has imposed sanctions on 4 people linked to the International Criminal Court